Hello YouTube, thank you for clicking on this video, and shout out to Big Daddy Algorithm for pimping it out to you. My name is Megan and welcome to my channel. I hope you've all had a good January. I know I, for one, am actually quite sad that it's over because I'm one of those weirdos who actually likes winter. I'm an indoor girl for the most part, so in the winter, I don't have to feel guilty for never wanting to go outside, which is great. In August when it's sunny, I always feel like I need to be outdoors to make the most of it, but I never really want to be outdoors, so then I just end up feeling guilty. So much easier when it's already crappy weather outside, then I don't have to feel bad for not being outside, right? But anyway, I digress. I am coming at you today with another LGBTQIA plus topic, and this is one that I've been wanting to do for actually quite a while. I just was collecting various information, data, videos, life experiences, etc., and I feel like I finally have enough ammo in my corner to actually make this video. So today we're going to be talking about Comphet. Yay. There's a lot of information about Comphet out there. So I thought I would just add to the conversation, or maybe for some of you, this is the first time you've ever heard about compulsory heterosexuality. So if you're one of those people, then welcome to something that us queers have to deal with all the frickin' time. Comphet is something I've been thinking about a lot over the past year and a bit as I've been doing all this work to deconstruct patriarchy. Ooh, that dirty P word. You're going to be hearing a lot of it in this video. So this is your warning to click away right now if you're sick and tired of us feminist broads moaning on and on about patriarchy, because this entire video is going to be me moaning on and on about patriarchy. So you've been warned. Anyway, Comphet is something that we all experience, whether we're queer or not, because we live in a society and that's just how it is sometimes. But it doesn't mean that that's how it has to be, and it doesn't mean that we have to be okay with it. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through the idea of compulsory heterosexuality, what it is, why it exists, and how it affects all of us, but particularly how it affects asexual, trans, and sapphic women, because we all get to have Comphet the most. Lucky us. Just a quick note, don't forget to like and subscribe if you also enjoy poking holes in some of society's most cherished institutions, because that's what we do on this channel, whether it's fashion or history or sexuality and LGBTQIA plus stuff. We like to just take all those things and we dig and we deconstruct them and we poke holes in them and we talk about all the things that are wrong with them. So if that's your jam, stick around. I'd love to have you. And leave a comment down below and let me know if there's anything along these lines that you'd like to know more about, because I want this channel to be a place that we can co-create together. I also do sewing tutorials and fashion history deep dives, so if that's your jam, feel free to stick around. It'd be great to have you here. All right, without further ado, let's get into it. What is Comphet? Comphet is short for compulsory heterosexuality, and it's a term that's used to describe the way in which our culture and society coerces us into seeing all intimacy and connection between men and women as being inherently romantic and sexual, even when it's not. It's also used to describe the ways in which our culture tries to force being straight on us, and it affects women in particular because it causes our sexuality and our identities to be defined by our relationships with men. The places where Comphet is most obviously and explicitly seen are in conservative religious communities where gender roles are strictly defined and women are actively encouraged to get married to men and become mothers. In these cultures, women's bodies are policed and seen as the properties of their fathers and then their husbands after they get married, and it's assumed that women are just naturally predisposed to desire a man's love and protection. This is Comphet at its most explicit and most obvious, but even in secular liberal circles, it's still at work. It's in the media, it's in advertisements, it's in popular books like Twilight, for example, which I know came from a conservative Mormon writer, but Twilight is a great example of Comphet at work.
Believe me, I want to. I just want to be married to you first.
It comes from movies and TV shows where relationships between cis-het men and cis-het women are romanticized and sexualized. Basically, like, straight love, straight romance is like all we see, and so we're sort of taught to desire it. Comphet ignores the existence of queer people, but it also erodes the possibility of deep, intimate, and strictly platonic friendships between straight men and straight women. Comphet is particularly bad for women because we're taught from an early age that it's our job to make men happy. We're supposed to look pretty for them, we're supposed to nurture them, manage their emotions, help them find themselves. Shout out to all the manic pixie dream girls out there.
Too many guys think I'm a concept, or I complete them, or I'm gonna make them alive. But I'm just a fucked up girl who's looking for my own peace of mind.
We're supposed to inspire men to do great deeds, make them comfortable, tiptoe around their egos, never let them be upset about anything, and we're supposed to let them do things for us so that they feel big and strong and powerful, and we're supposed to desire their love and protection more than anything else. When you grow up surrounded by these messages, whether by being told them explicitly or by seeing examples of them all around you, you're essentially being trained to see romantic and sexual relationships with men as the primary life goal, which you can then end up internalizing regardless of whether you genuinely want to be with men or not. The term compulsory heterosexuality was first coined by Adrienne Rich in an essay in 1980 called Compulsory Heterosexuality and Lesbian Existence. I'll link to the full essay below if any other social science nerds like me are watching this and want to read the whole thing, which I highly recommend because while it is pretty extreme in a lot of ways, it's a foundational text for understanding Comphet as a function of our socio-political system and how that system makes it tough for women to really be in touch with ourselves, regardless of whether we're queer or straight. In her essay, she argues that heterosexuality is an institution imposed on women in order to coerce and sometimes even violently force us to cater to men's desires. She questions the extent to which women would choose to be with men if all things were truly equal, and she challenges assumptions that most women are actually straight. She calls out the idealization of heterosexual romance in art, literature, media, advertising, etc., and lists out a number of ways in which media, culture, and patriarchy, there's that dirty P word again, convince women that marriage and sexual orientation towards men are inevitable. Her essay really got me thinking about systems of domination and control like patriarchy and white supremacy, and how possible it is to really genuinely love and trust someone who has power over you, even if it's a soft form of power like being a man in a heterosexual relationship. This is not to blame or shame the everyday individual people who are in positions of privilege and power. Hello, I'm a white woman, I know something about that. But to call out the systems that pit human beings against one another in the first place because they're not good for anybody. Just as an aside, I recently read The Women Could Fly by Megan Giddings, which is a dystopian feminist novel about a world in which magic is real and witches are persecuted, which is also why I've been thinking about this a lot. It's a fantastic book that explores the uncomfortable question of how deeply and authentically women and men can really love each other, even in those instances where we're nothing but kind to one another, in a world where there's always the possibility that men can subjugate and control us at any moment without us being able to do much about it. Back to Adrienne Rich, her feminism was problematic in a number of ways, not least because she excluded trans, bi, and pansexual women, but putting that aside for a second, her essay was groundbreaking because it paved the way for women to more closely examine our presumed straightness and then question the legitimacy of it. Now, I'm not saying that 100% straight women don't exist. Of course they do. What I am saying is that our culture assumes that being straight and cisgendered is the default state for everyone, and therefore being queer, genderqueer, and or trans is like some sort of anomaly. An anomaly that's becoming more and more acceptable, sure, but being queer is still othered to a large degree. This is damaging because it doesn't allow space for people to explore the possibility of being not straight, because being queer still hasn't been normalized to the same extent as being straight is seen as normalized and expected. Being straight is romanticized. Heterosexual marriage and motherhood are romanticized. Being queer is not romanticized. It's like seen as something that you kind of realize you are and then have to figure out, which is true, but there's no romanticization of it. So therefore, it's not aspirational in the same way as being heterosexual. As silly as this probably seems to straight people, a lot of women don't even realize that being queer is even an option for us until we've actually done the work to separate what's Comphet and what's actually us. Obviously, most of us know that queer women exist, but Comphet can make us think that being queer is for other people, not for us. When you start to realize that, okay, maybe you're not as straight as you thought you were, there can be this weird internal reaction that tells you, oh no, I must be straight. I'm just going through a phase. I'm not allowed to be queer. I must just be going crazy. Being queer is for other women, but it's not for me. This is just one of the many, many ways in which Comphet can cause women to gaslight ourselves into remaining in heterosexual dynamics, even if that's not what we really want deep down. So later on, if and when questions come up about your orientation and gender, you might just end up dissociating from them or repressing them, which can lead to pretty severe mental health consequences. I'm not going to get into details about that because I don't want to trigger anyone watching this, but I will leave some links in the description below that go a bit more into detail about the LGBTQIA plus community and mental health stats. It's pretty bleak. And a lot of it comes from trying to force ourselves into heteronormative boxes and from a fear of missing out on important life stages because of our queerness. Heterosexual cisgendered couples are normalized and emphasized and romanticized in our society, as I've already talked about, and they're what we see in like every love story and what we're raised to assume we'll be like someday too. Here's a little challenge for you. Try right now to think of 5 rom-coms in 30 seconds off the top of your head that have a heterosexual couple as the focus. Now try to think of 5 with a queer or polyamorous couple as the focus. No Googling. I'll wait. When we grow up surrounded by images and messaging that centers straight cisgendered couples, it makes it really hard to objectively examine and consider our own sexual and gender preferences from an unbiased, non-judgmental perspective. Even if you come from a very open, accepting, secular, liberal family, when all you see on TV shows and in movies as a kid are cis-het couples, you grow up thinking that this is normal and aspirational and everything else by default is just abnormal. Fear of missing out. No one wants to be abnormal, and Comphet can instill in us a fear of missing out on like normal human experiences like marriage and having kids. Even though queer people can get married in most places now, same-sex marriage wasn't legalized in Canada until 2005, and it took until 2015 for it to be legalized in all 50 US states. And that might very well be walked back very soon, depending on how their election goes later this year. Many of us were in high school and even older when same-sex marriage was legalized, meaning we'd already grown up with the idea that being queer meant we were effectively barred from participating in a lot of normal adult milestones. If you're queer but you also want to get married and or have a family, you may have grown up believing that's not possible for you. That's assuming you even knew you were queer early on in the first place, or that it's only possible if you're in a heterosexual relationship. So you may have ended up suppressing, denying, or dissociating from your queerness in order to have the life you want. Thankfully, things have been getting better, but with all this neo-fascist right-wing stuff going on in the world right now, it might very well end up getting worse for queer people before it actually does get better. But I digress. That's another video for another day. When it comes to queer couples having kids, things like surrogacy and IVF are prohibitively expensive, especially in today's economy. It's still much easier and cheaper for straight couples to have kids, assuming there are no fertility issues, which is a scary thing to consider if you want to have a family someday, but you think you might not be straight. Lack of access to fertility interventions because of their astronomical cost affects straight people too, of course, but queer people tend on average to be poorer than straight people. A 2019 study, which I will link to below, looked at rates of poverty in the queer community and found that more than 1 in 5 LGBTQIA plus adults, that's 22%, were living in poverty compared to 16% of their straight and cisgender counterparts. According to the data, trans and bisexual women have the highest rates of poverty, coming in at 3 in 10 adults, or 29%. That's almost twice as high as straight cis women. Being poor not only makes it more difficult to access adoption or fertility treatments, it also makes it more challenging to raise those children, even if you are able to get them. By making it harder for them to have a family, society is effectively encouraging bi and trans women to enter into heterosexual partnerships in order to achieve that goal, should that be a goal that they have. It's Comphet at work prioritizing and privileging straight couples and ignoring the existence of queer couples. On the other hand, a lot of queer people don't want to participate in the life script or the relationship escalator. Sometimes part of being queer means that you might feel uncomfortable with traditional institutions like marriage, monogamy, or parenting. In that case, it can still feel very isolating when you grow up surrounded by images and messages about how real adults have kids and settle down into nuclear families and participate in capitalism, and you have like absolutely no desire whatsoever to do any of those things. Despite the encouraging rise in child-free adults in recent years, thank God for that, our society is still very pro-natalist, and there's still a sort of default expectation that having kids is like the final boss of maturity. Especially for women, there's still a narrative out there that without kids we'll be unfulfilled, lonely, bitter, never know true love, blah, blah, blah. We've all heard that before. Even though statistically that's not true at all. In fact, the data shows that single child-free women have the highest levels of happiness and life satisfaction out of anyone, whether we're queer or not, and multiple studies have proven this. But it can still feel frustrating and isolating when you see your friends and family members pairing off and having kids and being swallowed up by marriage and motherhood, and you know for sure that you never will. You're not just waiting for the right time or the right person to come along and then you'll also get to join in all the domestic bliss. You're living in a whole different world from them, and the gap just gets wider all the time. I was talking to a friend of mine about this a little while ago and telling her that because I'm queer and child-free, my experiences of womanhood are very different from those of my mom and my sisters. I told her that sometimes it feels like I'm standing on a cliff on the other side of a deep canyon from them, and the more I unpack and uncover about myself, the wider the canyon gets. And that's with me being lucky enough to have a supportive family. Like, my mom and my sisters are nothing but loving and supportive. So I can't even imagine how much worse it is for queer people who don't have that. Looking back now, one of the earliest signs that I'm queer was my complete and total rejection of the idea of having kids. I'm not saying that all queer people hate the idea of having kids. Obviously, that's not even a little bit true. I'm just saying that for me personally, being grossed out by the whole idea of pregnancy and child rearing is very much wrapped up in my sexuality. I remember telling my mom when I was 9 years old that I probably didn't want to get married, and I definitely and absolutely did not ever want to have kids. And she just did that grown-up thing where she laughed it off and told me I would change my mind. I never did, and in fact, getting older and coming to terms with who I am only made me more and more confident in that decision. There's just something about the idea of using my body to shelter and feed another human being that was like grown from a man's genetic material that just gives me the biggest ick. If hetero sex is supposed to be the fun part of the reproductive process, then the rest of the whole pregnancy, childbirth, raising kids thing must be like a hellish Dickensian nightmare. And it seems massively unfair to me that women have to suffer through pregnancy and childbirth while men get to just stand by and complain when our bodies and our priorities change because of it. But then again, I digress. That's another topic for another day. I will probably do a video sometime on pronatalism because that's also a topic that is very fascinating. My point is, things like the life script and the relationship escalator are like held up on this pedestal by society, and that can feel very isolating for queer people, and it's a big reason why we tend to band together and create our own little communities. The life script. The life script is a way of measuring our lives by the accomplishment of certain expected cultural milestones like a first kiss or getting a driver's license or graduating university, getting married, having kids, etc. It's a socially prescribed order of events that we're encouraged and expected to participate in order to be considered fully fledged adults. After the birth of our first child, the big events then stop for us and start again for our kids, and then their milestones become ours too. Their first steps, their first tooth, their first word, first day of kindergarten, etc. Our lives are expected to then be like subsumed into the lives of our children. The life script is pervasive, and it's part of how heteronormativity and parenthood and Comphet are all enforced. There's a kind of unspoken rule that we should be achieving all of these milestones before the age of 30, at which point we should already be ensconced in a happy domestic life with our heterosexual spouse and our 2.5 kids. The whole idea of the relationship escalator, where you meet someone, fall in love, and then get married and have kids, can be completely intolerable to some queer people, especially if they happen to be asexual, polyamorous, and or also neurodivergent in some way. We often reject these heteronormative fantasies of adulthood because for a long time they were inaccessible to us and still are in a lot of places, and because they can feel very forced and unnatural to us. But we also don't see many alternatives modeled to us either in real life or in the media, so a lot of us are left to figure out our own ways of marking important events and milestones, which can be both liberating and extremely isolating when society and those around us don't always recognize and celebrate them in the same way that heteronormative milestones are celebrated. When we do see representations of queer people in the media, it's usually in the context of the life script. They're married or otherwise cohabitating, they're in monogamous relationships, they live in a house in the suburbs that they bought, and or they have kids. Many of them are also wealthy white gay men, so there is that.
The brooms have written their own brooms.
Bride, groom, broom.
They're queer, sure, but otherwise they're just like straight people. They are still being good adults and following the heteronormative life script, even though they themselves are not heteronormative.
We adopted a baby.
I don't want to yuck anyone's yum here because at the end of the day, it's still at least representation, but showing queer people in the media behaving exactly like straight people can actually be even more isolating and damaging than no representation at all. That kind of representation ignores the fact that oftentimes part of being queer means that you don't fit into these cultural norms like at all, and seeing gay people on TV be able to do that can just end up driving home the message that something is wrong with you for not being able to be heteronormative but in a queer way. Editing Megan here. When I was talking about representation in the media, I was mainly talking about the representation that I grew up with. So I'm talking about shows like Sex and the City and Modern Family, where you do see queer people and their stories are centered, but they're mostly upper middle class white gay men. There is much better representation now, which thank God for that. There's shows like Sex Education and BoJack Horseman, which does a really good job of centering the story of an asexual person and treats his story in a very realistic, very compassionate way. So representation is getting better. I did not mean that to say that there is no good representation of queer people. There is. It just wasn't around when I was growing up and when people my age and older were growing up. And so that kind of falls into Comphet in that if you're millennial, Gen Z, or older, you still grew up with these narratives of queer people mostly just being exactly like straight people, only queer. So hopefully younger generations will have better representation and will be able to grow up seeing more examples of how to be queer and different types of polyamorous relationships, non-monogamous situations, and that will be more normalized for them. But for those of us who are adults right now and struggling to dismantle a comphet, this is the kind of representation that we were offered, and this is why it can be so difficult. So didn't mean to knock the representation that's out there right now, rather to just criticize the ones that I grew up with. The reality is that the journeys of many queer people can look a lot different from those of straight people, and the media almost never shows this, or at least not in a positive light. We don't often follow the same timelines because Comphet can make it difficult for us to A, understand our own feelings and bodies and sexuality, and B, connect with others who feel safe and who share and understand and can help us validate certain aspects of our experiences. Queer time theory. Queer time theory is the idea that queer lives do not progress in the same way as the lives of straight people. Heteronormativity and the life script tell us that our lives are supposed to progress in a linear way from one milestone to the next, and when they don't, it can lead to a lot of shame and feelings of being othered because all of those traditional markers of adulthood often come with moral judgments and values attached to them. When you don't achieve them, you're seen as lazy or bad or something must be wrong with you. And for a lot of queer people and just people of my generation in general, considering our current socioeconomic climate, This can lead to a lot of internalized shame, low self-esteem, and feelings of depression and low self-worth. In 2018, Sarah Jaffe wrote in an article for JSTOR Daily, "What constitutes adulthood has never been self-evident or value neutral. If conventional markers of being an adult include getting a real job or purchasing property, for whom are these goals accessible? For whom are they a matter not of choice, but of economic reality?" I've already touched on the fact that LGBTQIA plus individuals experience higher rates of poverty than straight people do. This is due to a number of factors, including but not limited to discrimination, mental health struggles, and neurodivergence, the latter two being pretty common in the community. Being poorer on average than straight people can also limit and or delay our ability to participate in a lot of the expected milestones of adulthood. The internal struggles of growing up knowing that you're different but not knowing exactly how are still very real, and it can be challenging to figure all that out and decide what it means for you in your life. When you're expending a lot of emotional and mental resources, financial resources too, because therapy is expensive, just to figure out how your own body and emotions and sexuality work, it doesn't leave a lot left over for everything else, especially if you're already neurodivergent and get burned out very easily. It can take a lot of time to figure all this out, which can sometimes lead to this feeling of being outside of time or of not progressing through life in a linear way. There's time spent in the closet, time spent figuring out who we're attracted to and how that attraction works, time spent experimenting, and time spent looking for and building community. For trans people, there's time spent transitioning and essentially going through puberty all over again at whatever age you end up transitioning. And for many of us, there's time spent coming out, first to ourselves and then to others. Coming out isn't always a singular one-off event like how it's portrayed in the media. It can be, and often is, a recurring thing that we have to circle back to again and again as we uncover more layers of our queerness or experiment with it or discover new parts of ourselves, which can sometimes take years to really fully crystallize. We have to come out to new people we meet over and over again, which can be exhausting and scary, and is often a big reason why so many of us identify ourselves through sartorial cues like brightly colored hair or rainbow patches on our clothes or undercuts and septum piercings. Some queer identities even have specific cues that we can use to identify each other in the wild, like wearing a black ring on the middle finger of your right hand to signal that you're asexual. We're not presenting ourselves in this way to make being queer our entire identity or to be obnoxious or different or self-involved like a lot of straight people give us flack for. We do it so that we can recognize each other more quickly and not have to go through the emotionally exhausting process of entirely coming out yet again. This is something that I wish more straight people understood. Being queer often prevents us from experiencing time in a linear way, and being forced into the heteronormative life script can just end up delaying our ability to get in touch with ourselves and even hold us back from progressing in life. Many LGBTQIA plus kids grow up in trans, queer, and acephobic families and communities, which forces them to stay in the closet even if they're lucky enough to realize that they're queer early on. There aren't a lot of sociocultural scripts for how to be queer in a way that doesn't still follow the life script, and queer time theory is something that still isn't widely understood even in our own community. All of this can make time look very different for queer people. One of the best representations of this that I've ever come across is Virginia Woolf's Orlando, in which a 16th century nobleman basically lives forever, waking up one day in the 18th century as a woman and then living the rest of her life that way. It's a really good trans femme allegory that touches on how transitioning can often make people look ageless or even younger than they really are, but it's also a metaphor for how time can both speed up and slow down for queer people in general. Prolonged or second adolescence is a common experience, but there can also be an acceleration of events and milestones once you do come out of the closet. We've all heard those jokes about lesbians in U-Hauls, and there's a little bit of truth to that.
Hey, you ready for a second date?
For a lot of us, Comphet and heteronormativity can prevent us from even realizing we're queer until later on in life. Discovering yourself and then coming out can mean undergoing a second adolescence where you essentially have to experiment with sex and dating all over again, but this time in a way that hopefully feels more authentic and genuinely exciting. Depending on how long you spent in the closet, you might end up undergoing this process in your 30s, 40s, 50s, or even later in life. I've read stories of women in their 70s and 80s who didn't realize they were lesbians until their husbands died, and they emerged from decades of monogamous heterosexual marriage with an understanding that maybe they actually would have preferred to be with a woman all along. One story I read was about a woman in her 60s who realized she was a lesbian, and it took her such a long time to figure that out because she had always just assumed that all women don't really like having sex with men, and everyone thinks that women are objectively more attractive than men, and wives complain about their husbands, so what she was living through was just a normal heterosexual woman's experience, right? Unfortunately, a common thing in straight culture is to joke about how annoying and clueless your partner is. There's a whole subreddit called Are the Straights Okay?, which is basically just a collection of memes and videos of straight couples being extremely codependent and or just mean to each other, but in a joking way. It's really common for straight women to complain about their husbands and understandably lose attraction to them if the men don't pull their weight in the domestic sphere. And we see men and women complaining about each other in movies and TV shows all the time. Like, we've all heard those jokes about the old ball and chain.
Couldn't afford any more. Bye.
Hey, wait a minute. I've already got one of those.
Bye.
Hey.
We've all heard the jokes about the husbands being like incompetent, inept, etc. So you can see why, if you're not actually straight, you might think that this is just like a normal straight person's experience. All of this can be confusing for queer women who haven't yet realized they're queer, because it can just cause them to frame their own experiences of not being attracted to men as just normal straight girl problems, instead of recognizing their lack of attraction for what it actually is. This is Comphet, the assumption that you're still straight even when all of your experiences and desires tell you otherwise. Because Comphet affects women to such a large degree, late blooming lesbians are a very common phenomenon. Many studies have proven that politics and socialization can impact sexual development, and women are socialized from a young age to be pretty, to be nice, to be pleasing to men, and to center men's needs and desires, often at the expense of our own. This ends up isolating us from our own desires and disconnects us from what's happening in our own bodies. Comphet and lesbians. Comphet affects every queer person, but it's especially insidious for sapphic and asexual women because it conditions us from childhood to view all of our positive feelings towards men as attraction, even when they're not, and all of our positive feelings towards other women as platonic and friendly, even when they're not. Think about how when we see a little boy and a little girl playing together in the sandbox, our first thought as a society is to assume that they must have a crush on each other or that they'll grow up and fall in love, because wouldn't that be so cute? We project Comphet onto them by assuming that there's something more than just friendship going on there, even though they're children, or that someday there will be. Now, think about two little girls playing in the sandbox. We assume they must be best friends or like platonic sisters, never that there may be some attraction there or that someday there could be. Even like grown women that I know, like some of my friends, they get mistaken for mother and daughter when they're out in public all the time because like one of them looks a lot younger than she actually is. So like people will frequently come up to them in public and be like, "Oh, is this your daughter?" And my friend's just like, "No," like that's my wife, like no. So this is Comphet at work. Like society just like does not think like, oh, maybe this is actually a couple. Like no, they must be sisters, they must be related somehow, they must be best friends. Like we wouldn't assume that of a straight couple. If we see a man and a woman out together in public, we don't automatically assume that they're father and daughter or that they're brother and sister or that they're best friends. We assume that they're like romantically involved. Yet we assume when we see two women together that they can't be romantically involved. Like this is Comphet. This is Comphet at work, and you'd be surprised at how unconscious and automatic those assumptions can be. Growing up with these assumptions piled on you can make it really difficult to know the difference between what you've been taught to want and what you actually want. It can be easy to confuse simply admiring a man's style and accomplishments for attraction, or to confuse your excitement for what a man represents to you emotionally for a desire to be with him romantically and sexually. It can also be easy to mistake that deep love and admiration you have for another woman as a desire for her friendship, when maybe actually there's something more going on there. This is why it's not uncommon for women to realize that they're queer later on in life. It can take a long time to parse out what's social conditioning and what's actually you, especially if you're not actively and consciously doing the work to unlearn internalized homophobia and Comphet. Many late lesbians talk about the process of awakening to the fact that they never did like men as much as they thought. They just liked the feeling of being desired and chosen and validated by men, because patriarchy tells women that everything we do and how we choose to present ourselves should be for the goal of men's approval and enjoyment, and that we have no value if we don't obtain those things. Women who aren't chosen by men are pitied, and it's assumed that something must be wrong with them because no man wants them. The realization that you might have desired men only because of what they represent to you, both culturally and emotionally, and not because you loved and desired them for who they actually were as people, can be really jarring, and it's a common experience for late lesbians. I'm still trying to figure out all this stuff myself. Maybe making this video was a way for me to parse it out as much as it is my attempt to bring you what's hopefully useful information. But something that I've realized lately is that the men I did genuinely want and did genuinely fall for in the past were almost always unattainable in some way. They were either much older than me, or they were fictional cartoon characters, hello tuxedo mask, or they didn't like me back and never would, or they weren't interested in settling down and doing the life script thing. The men who did like me back and were completely available to me in like every possible way, I never felt the same way about, and I actually felt deeply uncomfortable and anxious when they pursued me or were clear about their interest in me and what they wanted from me. I've only ever been comfortable in situations where I was the one pursuing the man and it was on my terms and he wasn't as interested as I was. I even have this in my situation right now with my partner. I was the one who pursued him. Like, he did not pursue me. He did not ask me out. That was me. I did that. And that was the only way that I was comfortable engaging with him on that level. So like all throughout my life, whenever a man like fixes his gaze on me and pursues me, it makes me extremely uncomfortable. I always thought that that must be because I'm like emotionally unavailable in some way. And though that definitely has been true at some points in my life, depending on what else was going on the whole, I've always been very willing, eager, and comfortable with talking about and letting myself feel my emotions. I tend to be an anxious attacher and I wear my heart and my mind on my sleeve. But all my life, I've been avoiding emotional intimacy with men, cultivating it instead with my female friends or with men who I knew wouldn't get like too close to me. In sapphic and lesbian dynamics, the line between friendship and romantic attraction can be quite blurry sometimes, making it all the more difficult to figure out how you really feel about your friends. It's also really difficult for asexual people to navigate this because for the most part, they don't experience sexual attraction at all or very rarely, making it even less clear who we're attracted to and how. Although everyone can and does experience different types of attraction separately, people who aren't asexual generally tend to experience sexual and romantic attraction at the same time or like towards the same person or types of people. That makes it a little easier to figure out who you're attracted to and when, even with the comphet thrown in there. But when you mix up comphet with asexuality, it gets even harder to separate what's your social conditioning and what's actually you. Comphet and asexuality. Even though comphet is most often associated with sapphic and bisexual women and their experiences, it absolutely applies to aces as well, especially asexual women. Being an asexual person with comphet can be super confusing because sex is everywhere in our society. We're taught to want it, to think about it, to pursue it, and to prioritize it. And when you're not wired that way, it can lead to feeling broken and pathologized. Asexuality still isn't widely understood or accepted even in the queer community, and it's hard to know that you're experiencing a lack of sexual attraction if you don't even know what attraction is in the first place. There are so many things in our society that are highly sexualized, and this can feel isolating for aspec people. Comphet doesn't only enforce heterosexuality, it also enforces sexuality in general. I talked in a previous video about how the media dehumanizes asexual people by representing them as being autistic or aliens or robots and walking around with a feeling that no one will ever love you because you can't feel sexual attraction can be really scary. It can force ace people, especially ace women, to enter into relationships they don't truly desire, or to throw their own sexual and physical boundaries out the window to please a man out of a fear that he won't want us if we don't perform. This is obviously very damaging, and it can even be straight up traumatizing. Performance in general is a huge component of Comphet, and it's one that affects ace women in particular. They're expected to perform femininity, to be desirable and sexual for the benefit of men, and to refuse to do those things can mean not being chosen, which can lead to feeling invalidated and invisible. When we're in relationships with men, we're expected to perform sexuality and sexual desire regardless of whether we feel it or not. To not do these things can even be dangerous. We've all heard stories, and many of us have unfortunately had experiences of men not reacting to rejection very well. Much easier and safer to just shove our own needs and boundaries like way down deep and keep the straight men happy. Because Comphet centers men and their experiences of attraction and desire, it can lead to women feeling like we must be attracted to men because it feels good when they like us and find us beautiful and desirable, even if we don't and can't reciprocate that attraction. This is because we're taught to view our sexuality or lack of sexuality through the lens of the male gaze and male desires. Comphet and the male gaze. The male gaze is a concept that describes how women in the media and in real life are positioned as objects of male desire and male sexual fantasy. It's everywhere, from the movies and TV shows we watch to the ads we consume to the fiction we read and the socialization we're given from the time we're kids. It determines our cultural beauty standards and centers the male experience of desire, all of which leads us as women to overvalue our appeal to men and undervalue our own desires and forms of self-expression. In Adrienne Rich's essay on Comphet, she says, given the importance placed on the male sex drive in the socialization of girls as well as boys, early adolescence is probably the first significant phase of male identification in a girl's life and development. If you're a woman and you've ever looked in the mirror and thought that you're not attractive or picked apart some detail of your appearance like your nose or your skin, then you're reacting to the male gaze. Heterosexual beauty standards are everywhere all the time, and they're insidious. They get inside us. Without even thinking about it, we can dress for the male gaze, do our hair for the male gaze, walk and talk and behave in subtle ways to attract male attention and approval. Sometimes, as a woman, it can feel like we're always being watched by a silent, invisible man who's constantly scrutinizing us for our hotness, and then we put ourselves down when we don't measure up to that perfect 10 we're told that straight men want. This exhausting, ever-present feeling is called the internalized male gaze, and almost all women who grow up in this society have it to some extent, whether they're queer or not. We like the way it feels when men give us attention and when they approve of us because as women, we're taught that this is what we should strive for. It makes us valuable and valid. From Adrienne Rich's essay, as a young girl becomes aware of her own increasing sexual feelings, she turns away from her heretofore primary relationships with girlfriends. As they become secondary to her, recede in importance in her life, her own identity also assumes a secondary role and she grows into male identification. This is why it can make it so damn hard to determine whether or not your attraction to men is genuine. Craving and enjoying male attention isn't the same thing as being attracted to men. It's just a byproduct of living in a culture that's conditioned us to prioritize male approval above all else. It can lead us to perform pleasure when we're having sex with men, regardless of whether or not we're actually experiencing sexual desire and attraction organically and on our own. How many women do you know who have faked an orgasm? How many times have you faked it or had to close your eyes and picture something else or someone else just to get off? You can enjoy being good at sex and doing the things that we're taught men like. You can enjoy being desirable to men and the feeling of power and validation that you get from that. But if you rely on those things in order to enjoy sex with men, then it's not really attraction. It's a desire for sexual validation, and that is totally okay and very normal because that's what we're taught to want. Instilling these desires in us are a byproduct of Comphet, and they can become very loud and very demanding, drowning out that still, small voice inside of queer women that whispers, maybe we want something different, something else, someone else. Maybe we want no one at all. Centering men in the male gaze can and does obscure our own desires, and it can take a long, long time to get in touch with them. Much of that journey comes from doing the work of unlearning the male gaze, dismantling Comphet, and decentering men and their desires from our lives as women. If we do that work and then realize we still love and desire men genuinely, then we can move forward in life with confidence in that, knowing that it's coming from a place of truth and authenticity, not from a place of compulsory heterosexuality. But if we do that work and realize we don't actually like men as much as we thought we did, we just like it when they like us, then we can seek out experiences and express our sexuality and present ourselves in ways that feel more closely aligned with what we actually desire and who we actually are. I mentioned in a previous video that my queerness is very intrinsically tied to my feminism, and that's because I never would have realized I was queer in the first place without actively trying to figure out all the ways in which patriarchy, the male gaze, and Comphet fucked me up. I do not and never have dressed for the male gaze. I always thought that the clothes men like to see on women are boring, and that's sort of where it all started for me, but that's another video for another time. My point is, in order to recognize and understand all the ways in which our culture and how we were socialized as women and femmes have interfered with our ability to be in touch with ourselves, we need to start by sharing our stories and supporting one another. We need feminism. Comphet and fourth wave feminism. We are now in the fourth wave of feminism, which, as I talked about in my last video, is about intersectionality, queerness, and openness about sexual violence and coercion. For those of you who don't know much about feminism, here's the Coles Notes version of all four waves. The first wave was from the 1840s to the 1910s. The goal was women's suffrage and opening up opportunities for women in the public sphere, as well as women's safety in general. The second wave was from the 1960s to the 1990s. The focus there was on sexuality and reproductive rights, civil rights, and equality in the workplace. Third wave of feminism was from the mid-1990s to the 2010s. This was the return of lipstick feminism and the idea that traditionally feminine gender expressions and performances should be valued as highly as traditionally masculine ones. There was also a strong and arguably problematic focus on girl boss and pop feminism, especially in the 2010s. Fourth wave feminism is still in the process of unfolding and crystallizing, but it's starting to deeply criticize and question the roles of patriarchy and capitalism in subjugating women and calling out men for consciously and unconsciously exploiting women for our sexual, emotional, and physical energy and labor.
The invisible labor that goes into running and maintaining a household and a family. So it's not just the tasks and chores and responsibilities themselves. It's all the information that you need to keep track of about those tasks. So it's not just like, oh, I got to do the laundry. It's, oh, Timmy needs to have his soccer jersey by Tuesday, and I can't put these pants into the dryer because they shrink, and I have to buy this kind of laundry detergent, and we're almost out of the laundry detergent, so I need to get more laundry detergent on my next trip to the grocery store. Mental load is never ending, and it is all encompassing. And research has shown that in male-female relationships, the vast majority of mental load falls on the woman's shoulders.
Fourth wave feminism is becoming very invested in getting to the root of why men feel and have felt throughout history the need to control and subjugate women. The assumption has always been that men dominate women because they fear the sexual hold we have on them, as well as our insatiable sexual appetites. Back to Adrienne Rich's essay, she points out that men's need to have power over women actually comes from something far more primal and raw. It seems more probable that men really fear not that they will have women's sexual appetites forced on them or that women want to smother and devour them, but that women could be indifferent to them altogether, that men could be allowed sexual and emotional, therefore economic access to women only on women's terms, otherwise being left on the periphery of the matrix. This absolutely sent me when I read it, because isn't that what we're experiencing now? Those words were written more than 40 years ago, And that's exactly what we're seeing today in 2024. Men being decentered en masse from women's lives. As they should be. Women learning to decenter men is healthy, in my opinion, both for us and for men, because it forces them to cultivate stronger communities as well as more intimate and connected friendships with one another so that they don't have to rely on women to fulfill all of their emotional needs. But unfortunately, a lot of men don't see the positives in this. Instead of embracing the opportunity that feminism is offering them to live richer, more connected, and more fulfilling emotional lives, a lot of men are pushing back against a perceived loss of power by retreating into reactionary online spaces. We're seeing the rise of the manosphere of misogynistic academics like Jordan Peterson who cry about a male loneliness epidemic and a doubling down on conservative religious values that uphold traditional gender roles and teach women to fear the world so that we'll run for cover under the protection of the first man who offers it. I talked about that in my last video as well. Fourth wave feminism is seeking to bring about exactly the kind of world that men throughout history were trying to avoid. A world in which women may prefer the company of other women or seek out and build supportive communities instead of settling down into insular codependent marriages and losing themselves in motherhood. Or simply choosing to be alone, peaceful, and fulfilled in our creative passions and pursuits. Essentially, a world in which women have autonomy and are self-sufficient. Because when we have that, both internally and externally, how many of us would actually choose to rely on men, even those of us who genuinely are attracted to them? Men know this, they're afraid of it, and that's why patriarchy and Comphet make it so damn hard for us to actually get in touch with ourselves. Adrienne Rich points out that it becomes an inescapable question whether the issue feminists have to address is not simple gender inequality, nor the domination of culture by males, nor mere taboos against homosexuality, but the enforcement of heterosexuality for women as a means of assuring male right of physical, economic, and emotional access. Historically, men in power have done everything they can to ensure that women can't reject and abandon them. Even today, even if men aren't consciously trying to control and subjugate women's desires, if they're not actively doing the work to unlearn patriarchy, they're still unconsciously perpetuating it. Calling out instances of benevolent and non-benevolent sexism when we see it will help to dismantle Comphet and hold ourselves and men accountable when we consciously or unconsciously perpetuate it ourselves. Unlearning our own internalized misogyny and queerphobia and transphobia will also help others to more quickly see and understand when they're suffering from Comphet. Do you have Comphet? After watching all of this, especially if you're a woman or a femme-presenting person who identifies as straight, you may be wondering if you have a bad case of the Comphet too. My answer to that is probably, like I said in the beginning, regardless of your orientation, we all have Comphet to some extent. But just in case you're more deeply questioning things, here's a handy list of signs that you might not be as attracted to men as you thought you were. Number 1, you have a tendency to like unattainable men who, for whatever reason, will never like you back. Number 2, you only like men until they like you back. Number 3, you don't enjoy engaging in sexual acts with men. Number 4, you assume other straight women are lying or exaggerating when they talk about their attraction to men. Number 5, you keep your eyes closed when you're having sex with men. Number 6, you're only or mostly attracted to feminine men. Number 7, you wonder if you're really attracted to men. Number 8, you like the idea of being with men, but not the reality. Number 9, you like it when men are attracted to you and you try to be attractive to men, but you're not really attracted to them. Number 10, you don't really fantasize about men, or when you do, the fantasies are vague and non-specific or more emotional rather than sexual, or they include women in some way or are somehow otherwise queer in a way that like straight people would not be comfortable with. Number 11, you feel like you need to have a boyfriend. Number 12, when you do have a male partner, you wish they were less interested in sex and or romance. Number 13, you often feel like crying after having sex with a man, but can't quite figure out why. Number 14, you have sex with men to feel wanted and validated, not because you truly desire it. Number 15, you had a very close friendship with a girl growing up and you have complicated feelings about it. Number 16, when you watch rom-coms or more explicit films, you pay more attention to the woman than to the man. Sometimes you even imagine yourself in the role of the man. Number 17, you wonder if you're questioning your sexuality for attention or because it's trendy. This is internalized homophobia. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but it was taken from a well-circulated document called the Lesbian Master Doc, which was originally written by Tumblr user Angeli Lutz, I'm sorry if I butchered your name, in 2018, and has since made the rounds in various articles, forums, and social media posts. It was eye-opening, and if you have ever even for a second questioned your straightness, I would strongly recommend giving it a peek. I'll link to it below. The Master Doc has since come under some criticism for erasing bi, pan, and asexual women. However, it's still a great starting off point if you're wondering how attracted you really are to men, and it can definitely help you reframe some of your experiences and start those important conversations with yourself. All that to say, it's a really good jumping off point for exploring your sexual and romantic orientations without the lens of Comphet. A word of caution though, don't read it unless you're willing, eager, and prepared to deeply question things. If you really are straight, it will only reaffirm your straightness, so don't stress about that. But if you read it and feel seen and heard and then are left to cartoonishly roll your jaw up off the floor like a Looney Tunes character, well, you might have just taken that very first baby queer step into a brand new life. That's going to do it, my loves. Thank you to those of you who have made it all the way through this. If you enjoyed this video, once again, feel free to like and subscribe and let me know in the comments if there's a topic that you want to learn more about. My hope is that we can co-create this space together so that it's not just always me special interest info dumping all over the YouTubes. I want to know what you want to know about so that I can do the research and bring that information to you. I hope you have a good day wherever you are and whatever you're doing, and I will see you all in the next one. Toodaloo.